Charlotte Weaver had not eaten in 2 days when she finally saw the iron gate of the Coleman Ranch rising out of the dust. 11 miles she had walked on bare blistered feet, carrying nothing but a torn shawl and a letter that called her a debt still owed. Her knees gave out before she reached the porch. She fell hard into the dirt, too weak to lift her own head. A pair of boots stopped beside her. A rough hand turned her over gently, and a voice she did not yet know said the only 2 words that mattered: "You'll stay." Day. Before Charlotte opens her eyes and finds out exactly what those 2 words mean, if stories like hers of women the world gave up on and the men brave enough to stand beside them speak to your heart, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and stay with us all the way to the end. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Charlotte Weaver counted her steps because it was easier than counting her losses. 4,000 and some odd steps since the last fence post. 11 miles since the town of Larkspur Hollow had turned its back on her for good. She did not know the exact number anymore. Her feet had gone past counting, past feeling somewhere around mile 7 when the last of her stockings tore clean through and the dirt road began biting at her bare skin. She kept walking anyway. A woman learned to keep walking. Nobody taught her that in a schoolhouse. Grief taught her. Hunger taught her. The town of Larkspur Hollow, with its narrow eyes and narrower hearts, had taught her best of all. "Best you go on and try somewhere else, Mrs. Weaver," the banker had told her, not 2 weeks past, sliding a paper across his desk like it weighed nothing at all. "This town's got no charity left for widows who can't pay what's owed." She had wanted to ask him since when kindness came with a price tag. She hadn't asked. She had learned in 27 years of living that some men only heard their own voices, and Ezra Sloan was chief among them. She thought of Thomas. She always did when the walking got hard. Thomas Weaver had been a gentleman, a man who whistled while he worked, and never once in 4 years of marriage made her feel her size was a burden to carry. He used to say a woman's worth wasn't found on a scale that Charlotte's hands could coax more out of a garden and more out of a kitchen than any 3 women in the county put together, and he meant it every time he said it. Then the fever took him in November, quick and cruel, and left her alone with a mortgage she did not know existed, and a signature at the bottom of it that was not, she would swear on her mother's grave, in her husband's hand. "Forged," she had said to Sloan, standing in his office with her chin high, even as her voice shook. "That is not Thomas's signature, and you know it. Prove it." Sloan had answered, not even looking up from his ledger. She could not prove it. Not against a banker with the whole town's respect, and a widow with nothing left but a name. Nobody wanted to say out loud anymore. So they took the house. They took the land Thomas had cleared with his own 2 hands. They took in the end everything except the clothes on her back, and a single letter of reference that Mrs. Abigail Purnell, the only decent soul left in Larkspur Hollow, had pressed into her palm at the coach station. "The Coleman Ranch," Abigail had whispered, glancing over her shoulder like the words themselves were contraband. "Garrett Coleman's cook took ill and went to live with her daughter in Cheyenne. He'll need someone. He's a hard man to read, Charlotte, but he's fair. Walk out there. 11 miles, maybe less if you cut past the Miller property. Tell him Abigail sent you." 11 miles. Charlotte had laughed when she heard it, a short disbelieving sound, because she had eaten nothing in 2 days, and her shoes had worn through at the sole a week before that. But laughing had not filled her stomach, and it had not built her a roof, so she had wrapped what was left of her shawl around her shoulders and started walking before she could talk herself out of it. Now somewhere past the 9th mile, with the sun sitting low and mean on the horizon, she saw the gate. Iron letters arched over a wide wooden entrance, welded crooked in one corner, like a man had made it himself instead of paying a smith in town. Coleman Ranch. The letters read, and beneath them fields that rolled out gold and endless in every direction, cattle scattered across the grass like they owned more of the world than she ever would again. Her vision swam. She told herself it was only the sun. She told herself that all the way up the last stretch of road, one foot dragging after the other, her stomach twisting into something that no longer felt like hunger, and had started to feel like a fist closing slow around her ribs. She reached the gate. She would think later for the latch, though she never remembered her hand actually finding it. The ground came up to meet her instead. Charlotte Weaver, 27 years old, widow of Thomas Weaver, daughter of nobody important, folded into the dirt at the entrance of the Coleman Ranch without so much as a sound. One hand still curled tight around Abigail Purnell's letter, like it was the last true thing she owned. Garrett Coleman heard the dog before he heard anything else. Rufus, the old blue heeler, had been dozing under the porch overhang when his ears shot up and a low, insistent bark started up from the direction of the front gate. Garrett set down the length of rope he'd been coiling and looked toward the sound more out of habit than concern. Rufus barked at rabbits at wind at nothing at all some evenings. This bark was different. This bark did not stop. "Boss?" Silas Judd, his foreman going on 9 years now, came around the side of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, squinting toward the gate. "Somebody's down out there." Garrett was already moving. He crossed the yard at a stride that ate up ground-fast boots kicking up dust, and by the time he reached the gate, his mind had already sorted through the likely explanations. A drunk from town who'd wandered too far. A drifter looking for trouble. He'd had both before, and he kept a hand loose and ready near his hip out of old habit, not because he expected to need it. What he found instead stopped him cold. A woman. Face down in the dirt, one arm flung out ahead of her like she'd been reaching for something even as she fell. Brown hair had come loose from its pins and spilled across her shoulders, catching the last orange light of the day. Her dress was travel-worn, the hem caked in dust and torn in 2 places, and her feet. Garrett's jaw tightened when he saw her feet. Her feet were bare and bleeding. "Ma'am." He dropped to a knee beside her hand, hovering unsure for one useless second where it was even safe to touch. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" "Nothing." "She's breathing," Silas said, catching up, crouching on her other side. He looked her over quick, the way a man looks over a horse that's gone down in harness, searching for the wound before he searches for anything else. "Ain't bleedin' nowhere I can see 'cept them feet. Reckon she just plain walked herself into the ground." Garrett turned her over as gently as his big hands allowed, and for the first time saw her face. Younger than he'd guessed from the state of her. Full-cheeked, soft-featured, the kind of face that probably smiled easy when it wasn't half-starved and unconscious in the dirt. She was a big woman, broad through the shoulders and hips, in a way the ladies back in town would have whispered about behind gloved hands. But Garrett Coleman had spent 34 years learning that a person's size told him exactly nothing about their worth, and he was not about to start unlearning that lesson over a woman he hadn't even met. "She's got a letter," Silas said, nodding at the paper still crushed in her fist. "Leave it." Garrett was already sliding one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her shoulders. She weighed more than he expected to lift easy, and he adjusted his stance, planted his boots, and came up with her cradled against his chest, like it cost him nothing at all because he'd be damned if he'd let Silas or anybody else see it cost him something. "Get the door." "Boss, we don't even know who she—" "Get the door, Silas." Silas got the door. The first thing Charlotte understood coming back to herself was the smell of bread. Not baking bread. Bread already baked sitting somewhere close, and beneath it, the mineral tang of well water, and the particular smoke and leather smell of a working ranch house. She kept her eyes shut a moment longer, holding on to the smell of that bread, like it might vanish the second she looked at it too hard. "She's stirring," a woman's voice said, somewhere off to her left. Older, brisk kind around the edges. Charlotte opened her eyes. She was on a narrow bed in a room she did not recognize, a quilt pulled up over her, and an older woman with iron-gray hair and flour on her apron was pressing a cool cloth against her forehead. Behind the woman, filling most of the doorway, stood a man. He was tall. That was the first thing before anything else registered. Tall and broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with softness. His skin weathered brown from years under an unforgiving sun. Dark hair pushed back from a face that might have been carved, rather than born, all hard lines and quiet watching. His eyes, when they found hers, were a deep, steady brown, and there was something in them Charlotte did not expect to find in a stranger's eyes. not pity. She had seen pity aplenty these last 2 weeks, and she knew its shape well enough to recognize its absence. Where? Her voice came out cracked and thin. She tried again. Where am I? Coleman Ranch. The man's voice matched the rest of him, low and unhurried. You went down at my gate a couple hours back. Mrs. Abernathy here's been tending you. Drink this first, dear, before you go asking questions. The older woman, Mrs. Abernathy, apparently the ranch's housekeeper, pressed a cup of water into her hands, and Charlotte drank it too fast and nearly choked, and drank the second cup slower, and only then let herself really look at the man still standing in the doorway, like he was keeping guard over something. You're Mr. Coleman, she said. It was not a question. Garrett Coleman. I am. Abigail Purnell sent me. She struggled to sit up straighter against the pillow, some old habit of pride refusing to let her lie flat and small in front of a stranger, even a stranger who had apparently carried her in off his own front gate. She said you'd lost your cook, said you might need another. Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise, more like a man recalculating a sum he'd already worked out in his head. You walked out here for a cooking position. I walked 11 miles for a cooking position. Mr. Coleman and I intend to earn it, not be handed it out of pity, because I fainted at your gate like some fragile little thing out of a dime novel. The words came out sharper than she meant, fueled by 2 weeks of swallowed anger, finally finding a place to land, and she saw Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows lift toward her hairline. I apologize. That was ill-mannered. No. Something that was almost not quite the beginning of a smile touched the corner of Garrett's mouth. That was honest. I don't mind honest. My name is Charlotte Weaver. She held out a hand that was still shaking faintly from hunger she was doing her level best to ignore. I can cook for 40 men without a wasted scrap. I can bake, preserve, mend, and I have kept a household ledger balanced to the penny for 4 years running. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Coleman. I am asking for work. Garrett looked at her outstretched hand a long moment. Then he crossed the room and shook at his grip careful, like he'd already noted the raw state of her palms and did not intend to add to it. When'd you last eat, Mrs. Weaver? She hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything her pride would not. Thought so. He turned toward the door. Mrs. Abernathy, get her a plate, a full one. He paused, looking back at Charlotte with an expression she could not yet read, though she would come to know it well in the weeks ahead, the look of a man deciding something and deciding it for good. We'll talk terms once you've eaten. Not before. She ate at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, and she ate like a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust that a meal would still be there if she looked away from it too long. Garrett sat across from her, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching without seeming to watch the way a man watches cattle. He's counting without wanting them to know they're being counted. Silas tells me you had a letter, he said finally. Charlotte set down her fork. From Mrs. Purnell. It says I'm honest, hard-working, and that my former circumstances were no fault of my own character. She reached into the pocket of her dress, produced the crumpled paper, and slid it across the table. Garrett read it slow, the way a man reads something he intends to remember. Your former circumstances, he repeated, setting it down. Care to tell me what those were, Mrs. Weaver, or would you rather I not ask? She could have lied. She had considered lying somewhere around mile 6, rehearsing a simpler story in her head, widowed, moved on, nothing more to it. But something about the steadiness in Garrett Coleman's eyes made lying feel like an insult to whatever this was between them, this strange kindness he'd shown a stranger who'd collapsed at his gate. My husband died this past November, she said. Fever took him quick. 3 days and he was gone. Her hands found each other in her lap, twisting. After he passed the town banker, a man named Ezra Sloan produced a mortgage note on our home, a note my husband never signed. I know his hand, Mr. Coleman. I balanced his books for 4 years. That signature was not his. Garrett's jaw had gone tight, a muscle working at the corner of it. Sloan, he said, like the name tasted foul. You know him. Larkspur Hollow's bankers had his hand in half the ranches in this county at one time or another. Garrett's voice had dropped, gone flat and hard, in a way that made Charlotte understand suddenly why the men in town spoke of him with a certain careful respect. "Man's got a talent for finding debts nobody remembers owing." "He took the house," Charlotte said, and hated the way her voice thinned out on the words. Hated it enough that she pressed her lips together and forced the next part out, steady. "He took the land Thomas cleared himself. He told me to my face that a woman alone with no proof and no standing in town had no business arguing with a man of his position. So I left. I had nowhere else to go and no one left to ask except a letter from the one woman in that whole town who still looked me in the eye." The kitchen went quiet a moment. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and settled. "You've got standing here," Garrett said finally. Charlotte looked up. "I don't know you, Mr. Coleman." "No, ma'am, you don't." He set his cold coffee aside and leaned forward, forearms on the table, and for the first time since she'd woken in that narrow bed, Charlotte felt the full weight of his attention land on her, direct and unflinching. "But I know Ezra Sloan, and I know a forged signature when a woman describes one shaking like you just did, and I know a person's character a fair sight better from watching them eat a meal. Like it might be their last than from anything the town gossips have to say about them. You want the cooking position, it's yours. Room's the same cabin my last cook had. Wages paid monthly, same as the hands. You'll answer to nobody in this house but me, and when I ain't around to Mrs. Abernathy." Just like that. Charlotte could hardly credit it. 2 weeks of doors closing, of eyes sliding away from her, of a town deciding her worth before she'd said a single word to defend it. And now this. A stranger's ranch, a stranger's kindness offered plain and without conditions. "Just like that," Garrett confirmed. "I judge a person by their work and their word, Mrs. Weaver. Not by the size of them, not by what some banker back in town decided to say about their circumstances. You want to prove yourself, you'll get every chance to. But you don't owe me gratitude for hiring a cook I genuinely need. That's just good business." It was not Charlotte suspected only good business. Something in the careful way he'd said it, like a man building a wall around a kindness he didn't want. Examined too closely, told her there was more to Garrett Coleman than a rancher filling a vacant position. But she was too tired, too hollowed out from the walking and the weeks before it to press the question. "Thank you," she said instead, simple and plain, because it was true, even if he didn't want to hear it dressed up any further. Garrett nodded once like the matter was closed and rose from the table. "Rest tonight. Kitchen starts at 4:30. Men expect breakfast on the table by 5 sharp, and they are not a patient lot when they're hungry." "I won't disappoint you, Mr. Coleman." He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with that same unreadable expression from before. "Folks in this county have got a habit of underestimating people they've decided not to look at too close," he said. "I don't much care for that habit. Get some sleep, Mrs. Weaver." Word traveled fast on a working ranch, faster than a rider could carry it. And by the time Charlotte rose at 4 in the morning to light the kitchen stove, every hand on the Coleman spread already knew the boss had taken in a half-starved widow off the road and put her in charge of feeding them all. Not everyone approved. "A big gal like that cooking for a full crew." Charlotte heard the voice through the kitchen window, before the sun had even cleared the ridge low, but not low enough, belonging to one of the younger hands, a lanky boy named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 20. "Boss done lost his sense taking in strays off the road. You watch your mouth, boy." That was Silas, sharp enough to carry. "That woman walked 11 miles on bleedin' feet, 'stead of lying down and quittin'. Man wants to judge somebody's worth, he ought to start there." Charlotte kept her eyes on the stove and said nothing. Though her chest had gone tight and hot, with an old familiar shame, she'd hoped foolishly that 11 miles of walking might have left behind her in Larkspur Hollow. She would not let it show. She had breakfast on the table at 5 sharp flapjacks, stacked high eggs, bacon fried crisp biscuits with gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. And she stood at the head of the table with her chin up, while 8 ranch hands filed in and stared at the spread like men who hadn't eaten a hot meal cooked with care in longer than they cared to admit. Nobody said a word for a full minute. Then a broad-shouldered hand named Dutch Gray at the temples, and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some old accident he never spoke of, picked up a biscuit, tore it in half, and went very quiet and very still. "Lord have mercy," Dutch said low like it was a prayer. "Woman, marry me." The table burst into laughter, rough and easy, and Charlotte felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 2 weeks. "I already buried one good husband, Mr. Dutch," she said, sliding a plate of eggs down the table. "I'll settle for you eating your breakfast before it goes cold." More laughter. Even Pete, red around the ears, ducked his head and reached for a biscuit without further comment. Garrett watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. But Charlotte caught his eye once across the crowded table and saw unmistakably, this time the corner of his mouth curve up before he turned and walked back out toward the barn. The trouble came on the 4th day, riding in on a black gelding with a saddle too fine for honest ranch work. Charlotte was hanging wash behind the cabin when she heard the hoofbeats slow at the gate, and something in the sound, unhurried, entitled a man who expected the world to stop for him, made the back of her neck prickle before she'd even turned around. She turned around. Ezra Sloan sat his horse at the edge of the yard, dressed in a fine black coat, entirely wrong for the heat. A leather satchel of papers tucked under one arm like a weapon. He was only waiting for the right moment to draw. "Mrs. Weaver." He touched the brim of his hat, and the gesture, which might have looked courteous from any other man, felt to Charlotte like a slap dressed up in manners. "I did wonder where you'd got yourself off to. Took some doing tracking you clear out here." Her hands went still on the wet linen in her grip. "What do you want, Mr. Sloan?" "Same as I've wanted since November, Mrs. Weaver. What's owed?" He swung down off his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life had a door closed in his face. $312 by my ledger plus accruing interest, and I understand you've found yourself gainful employment. Regular wages. That's good. That's very good. Makes collection a good deal simpler than chasing a woman with nothing to her name. I owe you nothing." Charlotte set the laundry basket down, slow, deliberate, buying herself a moment to steady her voice. "That mortgage was forged, and you know it was forged, same as you knew it the day you slid that paper across your desk and told me to prove otherwise. I know no such thing." Sloane's smile did not waver. "I know a signed note, and I know a widow who's run out of places willing to take her in. This is the last one, isn't it? Ranch out here's your last stop before you're back on the road with nothing." He glanced past her toward the main house, toward the barn, where the ring of a hammer on metal had gone suddenly noticeably silent. "I'd hate for Mr. Coleman to find out he's harboring a debtor. Man's got a reputation to think of. Wouldn't want folks in town saying he's the type to shelter a woman skipping out on what she's owed." "She's not skipping out on anything." Garrett's voice came from behind her, low and even, and carrying the particular stillness of a man who had walked up quiet and heard every word he needed to hear. Charlotte turned. He'd come from the barn sleeves, still rolled to the elbow, a hammer set down somewhere behind him, and every hand within earshot. Silas Dutch, Pete, 3 others she hadn't yet learned the names of, had drifted into the yard behind him without a single one of them making a show of it. "Mr. Coleman." Sloane's smile thinned just slightly. "This doesn't concern your operation. This is a matter between myself and Mrs. Weaver regarding a debt. A debt you can't prove." Garrett stopped a few feet off, close enough that Charlotte could feel the shift in the air, the way the whole yard seemed to reorganize itself around him without anyone giving an order. "Mrs. Weaver told you that signature wasn't her husband's. I've read enough contracts in my life to know a forged one when I hear the details laid plain. You want to collect a debt, Sloan, you bring a judge, and you bring proof. Otherwise, you're trespassing on my land, harassing a woman in my employ, and I'd take that considerably personal." Sloane's eyes flicked from Garrett to the row of hands standing quiet and unmoved behind him, and something in his calculation visibly shifted. "You'd stake your name on a woman you've known 4 days. I'd stake my name on plain honesty, which is a sight more than I've ever seen out of you." Garrett's voice hadn't risen not once, but there was iron running clean through the middle of it now, and Charlotte, watching him, felt something in her chest crack open in a way she did not have words for yet. "Mrs. Weaver's under my roof. She earns her wage same as any hand on this spread, and I don't care to explain myself twice on the matter." You've got business in Larkspur Hollow, Sloane. I suggest you ride back to it." For a long moment, nobody moved. Somewhere off past the barn, a horse stamped and blew, and the wind picked up faint across the grass, and Ezra Sloane stood in the Coleman ranch yard with his fine coat and his leather satchel, and found for the first time in longer than he could likely remember that his usual weapons reputation position. The quiet threat of ruin had met something they could not cut through. "This isn't finished," Sloane said, finally swinging back up onto his horse with considerably less grace than he'd dismounted. "I have papers, Coleman, legal papers. You'll find yourself on the wrong side of a courtroom before the season's out, and that woman with you. Then I reckon I'll see you there." Garrett didn't so much as blink. "Good day, Sloane." Sloane wheeled his horse hard and rode out through the gate at a pace considerably faster than the one he'd ridden in on, and the yard stayed silent until the sound of hoofbeats had faded clean into the distance. Then Dutch let out a low whistle. "Well, reckon that's the most excitement we've had round here since the bull got loose in Ms. Abernathy's garden." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, and the hands began drifting back toward their work, but Charlotte stood rooted where she was staring at Garrett Coleman like she was seeing him clear for the first time. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, once the yard had mostly emptied. "You barely know me." Garrett looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that he did not seem inclined to name out loud, not yet. "Man rode onto my land to threaten someone under my protection," he said finally. "Don't much matter how long I've known you, Mrs. Weaver. That's not a thing I abide." He turned to head back toward the barn, then paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "Sloane's the kind that don't quit easy. You ought to know that going forward." "I do know it," Charlotte said. "I've known it since November." "Then you also ought to know you're not facing it alone anymore." He walked off towards the barn, without waiting for her answer, and Charlotte stood in the yard with the wet linen forgotten at her feet. One hand pressed flat against her chest, like she could hold in place whatever it was that had just cracked open there. Watching the back of a man who had in 4 short days become the first person since Thomas died to stand between her and the whole wide world without asking her for a single thing in return. Charlotte finished pinning the last of the wash to the line, long after the sound of Sloane's horse had faded, her hands working on their own, while her mind stayed fixed on the words he'd thrown at her like stones. Legal papers. Courtroom. That woman with you. She had brought trouble onto a man who owed her nothing. "You're thinking too loud," Silas said, coming around the corner of the cabin with a coil of fence wire over one shoulder. "I can hear it from the barn. I'm thinking Mr. Coleman didn't hire himself a war when he hired a cook." "Maybe not." Silas set the wire down, leaned against the porch post, and studied her with the particular squint of a man who'd worked cattle long enough to read trouble in a person's shoulders before they ever said a word about it. "But I've been on this ranch 9 years, Mrs. Weaver, and I never once seen Garrett Coleman stand up for a hired hand the way he just stood up for you. Man doesn't do things he don't mean. He barely knows me. Don't reckon that matters much to him." Silas picked the wire back up, tipping his hat an inch as he turned to go. "Boss judges by what he sees, not by what folks tell him he ought to see. You cook that crew another meal like this morning's, you won't have a worry left in this yard, 'cept keeping Dutch from proposing marriage a second time." That earned a small, surprised laugh out of her, the first real one in longer than she cared to count, and she carried it with her back into the kitchen, like something worth holding on to. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Charlotte had not expected to find again so soon. She woke before the sun. She had biscuits rising and bacon in the pan before the first hand stumbled in rubbing sleep from his eyes, and by the second week, even Pete, the lanky boy who'd called her a stray to Silas's face, had taken to lingering by the stove of a morning to ask after seconds, in a voice gone considerably more polite than his first opinion of her. "You put something in the gravy," Dutch declared one morning, pointing his fork at her like an accusation. "Ain't natural gravy tasting like this?" Butter, Mr. Dutch, and patience, neither one's a secret. Well, it ought to be illegal. The kitchen had very nearly caught real trouble on the 9th day, when a grease fire jumped the skillet, while Charlotte's back was turned, tending the bread, and half the crew came running at the smell of smoke, to find her already smothering it with a wet flour sack, calm as church on Sunday, not so much as a raised voice out of her the whole while. "Lord," Dutch said, staring at the blackened skillet once the flames were out. "Woman fights fire, same as she fights everything else. Head on, and no fuss about it." Garrett had come running from the barn at the first shout, and by the time he reached the kitchen door, the danger was already past the fire. Smothered Charlotte sweeping up the mess with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, like nothing more than an inconvenience had occurred. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the scene, and something in his face Charlotte thought looked almost like pride. "Everyone accounted for. Everyone's fine, Mr. Coleman. Breakfast'll be 10 minutes late is all. I've waited longer for worse reasons." He lingered another moment before he turned to go, and Charlotte caught the look he gave her, quick and warm, and gone almost before she'd registered it, and told herself firmly not to make more of it than it was. She was failing a little at that particular instruction to herself. It was 2 evenings later, with the crew fed and the kitchen swept, and the sky gone the deep, bruised purple of a Wyoming dusk, that Charlotte found Garrett sitting alone on the porch steps. A cup of coffee gone cold beside him, staring out at nothing in particular. "You're not one for sitting idle from what I've seen," she said, coming to stand near the rail. "Not usually." He didn't look at her right away. Some evenings the quiet catches up regardless. She should have gone back inside. She knew that even as she lowered herself onto the step beside him, careful of her skirts, close enough to talk, but not so close as to presume anything. But something about the set of his shoulders, the particular loneliness in a man who owned more land than most people in the territory, and still sat alone every night with a cold cup of coffee, made her stay. "You lost someone," she said. It was not quite a question. Garrett's jaw worked a moment before he answered. "Rachel. 10 years back this spring." He turned the cold cup in his hands, not drinking it. "We were to be married. Fever took her the same way it took your Thomas near enough. 3 weeks before the wedding." He said it plain, without drama, the way a man says a thing he has said to himself so many times in the dark that it has worn smooth. "I built this ranch up big in the years since. Told myself the work was the point. Told myself that a good long while. And now," he looked at her then, and Charlotte felt the full weight of that steady brown gaze land on her direct, in a way that made her chest go tight and warm all at once. "Now, I'm not so sure the work was ever the point," he said quietly. "Not the whole of it anyway." "What was she like?" Charlotte asked, gentle, ready to let the question drop if he didn't want it. He didn't drop it. "Stubborn. Quick to laugh. Never once let me win an argument just because I was bigger than her." A ghost of a smile crossed his face there and gone. "She'd have liked you, I think. She never had much patience for folks who judged a person before they'd earned the right to." "I'm sorry you lost her. I'm sorry you lost your Thomas." He turned the cup once more in his hands, then set it down for good. "Funny thing about grief. Man thinks it's going to flatten him permanent. Then one evening he's sitting on his own porch steps talking to a woman he's known less than a month, and it doesn't feel so much like drowning anymore." Charlotte's breath caught quiet in her chest. "That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman, Mr. Coleman." Wasn't trying to be careful about it. He glanced at her sideways, something warm and unguarded in his eyes that she had not seen from him before. "Careful hasn't gotten either one of us very far these last 10 years, has it?" She had no answer for that, none she trusted herself to speak aloud, and so she let the silence carry the weight of it instead. Neither of them said anything further after that. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It sat between them like something new and careful being built one board at a time, and Charlotte found she did not want to be the one to disturb it. It was Rufus barking sharp at the gate that broke the moment instead. A rider came in fast under the last of the light, and Garrett was on his feet before the horse had fully stopped, one hand dropping automatic to his hip. "Easy!" Silas called from the bunkhouse already crossing the yard. "That's Tom Ferris, county clerk's boy." The young man swung down breathless, a folded paper clutched in one fist. "Mr. Coleman, Pa said get this to you tonight, said it couldn't wait for morning." Garrett took the paper, unfolded it beneath the porch lantern, and Charlotte watched his face change by degrees as he read first confusion, Then something colder, harder. A stillness settling over him that she had not seen even in the yard against Sloane. "What is it?" she asked when the silence had stretched too long to bear. Garrett handed her the paper without a word. Charlotte read it twice before the meaning settled fully. A filing at the county courthouse dated that very afternoon, naming Charlotte Weaver as a debtor, with an outstanding note of $312, and beneath it a second notice, filed the same hour questioning the boundary survey on the original Coleman land grant, citing an irregularity in a deed transfer some 20 years past, long before Garrett had ever taken over the ranch from his father. "He's not just coming after me," Charlotte said slowly, the paper trembling in her hands. "He's coming after your land." "Looks that way." Garrett's voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way of a man holding something dangerous very still. "Mr. Coleman?" Tom Ferris shifted his weight clearly, wishing to be anywhere else. "Pa said to tell you Sloane's been in the courthouse 3 days running, talking to the judge's clerk, talking to half the county commissioners over cards at the Larkspur Hotel. Man's building something, and Pa figured you'd want warning before it landed. Tell your father I'm obliged." Garrett folded the paper, slow, deliberate, and Charlotte watched him fold his anger down, along with it, tucking both away someplace steady. "Ride safe home, Tom." The boy nodded and was gone into the dark within the minute, hoofbeats fading, and the yard went quiet again, except for the low, worried murmur of the hands who'd gathered near the barn without anyone calling them. Charlotte turned to Garrett, and the guilt in her chest had gone from an ache to something closer to a wound. "This is my fault." "No. He wouldn't have looked twice at your land title if I hadn't walked through your gate." Her voice was shaking now, and she hated it, hated that 2 weeks of hard-won steadiness could crack this fast. "I should go, tonight, before this costs you the whole ranch, everything you and your father built." Charlotte. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it stopped her mid-sentence as surely as a hand on her arm. "You think a man like Sloane needed you for an excuse?" Garrett's voice had gone low, hard-edged, but the anger in it was not aimed at her, and she understood that, even before he said the next part. "Men like him have been circling ranches like mine for 20 years, looking for a crack in a deed, a smudge in a survey, anything to pry a man off land he's spent his life working. You didn't hand him a weapon, Mrs. Weaver. You just happened to be standing near me the day he decided to use the one he already had." "You can't know that." "I know Ezra Sloane." His jaw tightened. "I know he's wanted this ranch's water rights since before I was old enough to shave. This isn't about you leaving. This is about you staying, and both of us fighting a man who spent 20 years learning how to steal a legal way." Charlotte wanted to believe him. Wanted it so badly it frightened her, because believing him meant hoping again, and hope had cost her plenty these last 2 weeks. "And if you lose," she said quietly, "if he takes it all anyway, then I lose it fighting instead of handing it over quiet." Garrett met her eyes steady in the lantern light. "I didn't build this life to be the kind of man who runs when it gets hard, Mrs. Weaver. I don't intend to start now." She did not have an answer for that. She only nodded, and something passed between them in the quiet that followed that felt to Charlotte considerably more binding than any wage or any contract could have made it. The trouble did not wait long to show its face again. 3 mornings later, Dutch came riding in from the north pasture at a pace that had every hand in the yard dropping. What they held his horse lathered his voice cracking across the yard before he'd even swung down. Boss North fence is cut clean through in 4 places. Herds scattered halfway to the Miller line. Garrett was already moving toward the barn, shouting orders, and within minutes the yard had emptied of every able hand, leaving Charlotte alone with Mrs. Abernathy, and a silence that felt considerably too large for the both of them. "Cut fence don't happen by accident," Mrs. Abernathy said, wringing a dish towel between her hands. "Not 4 places at once." "No," Charlotte agreed grimly. "It doesn't." They rode back and past dusk, tired and dust-caked. Most of the herd recovered, but 4 heads still missing, and one of the young hands, a boy named Willis, thrown from his horse in the scramble and nursing a wrenched shoulder that had Mrs. Abernathy fussing over him at the kitchen table within the hour. Garrett came in last, jaw set, a length of cut wire in one fist that he set down on the table hard enough to make the lamp shudder. "Clean cuts," he said to no one and everyone. "Wire snips, not a break from weather or a bull leaning on it wrong. Somebody did this deliberate, and they did it knowing exactly when my hands would be spread thinnest." "Sloan," Charlotte said. "Can't prove it. Man's too careful to swing the snips himself." Garrett's hand closed into a fist beside the ruined wire. "But I don't believe in coincidence, and I sure as hell don't believe Ezra Sloan files papers on my land title on a Tuesday and my north fence turns up cut on a Friday by pure bad luck." Charlotte set a plate in front of him he did not touch. "You should eat. I should sleep for about a week, and neither one's happening tonight." He scrubbed a hand down his face, and for the first time since she'd known him, Charlotte saw the tiredness underneath the steadiness. "Silas is doubling the night watch starting tomorrow. I want you keeping the cabin door barred after dark. You hear me? I don't know what Sloan's willing to try next, and I'm not taking chances with it." "You're worried for me. I'm worried for everyone under my roof." He looked at her, and something in the careful distance he tried to keep in his voice cracked just slightly, just enough for her to see through it. "You most of all, if you want the plain truth of it." She did want the plain truth of it. She wanted it badly enough that she reached across the table and set her hand over his work-roughened palm against work-roughened palm, and neither of them pulled away. "I'm not going anywhere, Garrett Coleman. Didn't figure you would." The corner of his mouth turned up faint and tired, but real. "Stubborn woman. Learned it from somewhere." She squeezed his hand once before drawing hers back, cheeks warm, suddenly aware of Mrs. Abernathy watching the two of them with an expression she was making no effort at all to hide. "Eat your supper. Sloan can wait until morning." He ate. It was a small victory, but Charlotte would take it. She took to walking coffee out to the night watch after that, a small thing, a pot and a stack of tin cups balanced on a tray as she crossed the dark yard toward whichever fence line Silas had posted men along. The hands never asked her to. She did it anyway because a woman who had spent 2 weeks being told she was a burden to everyone around her had discovered out here that she did not know how to sit idle while other people carried a fight on her behalf. "You oughtn't be out here past dark, Mrs. Weaver," Willis told her one night, his shoulder still bound up tight from the fall, sitting his post one-handed with a rifle propped awkward against the fence post beside him. "Boss'd have my hide if something happened to you out here." "Then I suppose we'd best make sure nothing does." She poured him a cup steam, curling up into the cold night air. "How's the shoulder?" "Mendin'. Mostly on account of you not lettin' Mrs. Abernathy fuss me clean to death with her poultices." He grinned quick and boyish. "Reckon we're all mighty glad the boss let you stay, ma'am. Whatever Sloan's stirring up in town." "Even Pete?" Willis laughed under his breath. "Especially Pete. Boys near talked my ear off about how sorry he is for what he said that first mornin'. You scared him plenty standin' up to Sloan's man 'stead of runnin' off crying." Charlotte carried that back to the kitchen with her warm against the cold walk home, and told herself it was foolish to feel so much pride over the good opinion of a 19-year-old ranch hand. She felt it anyway. It was 2 nights later, crossing back from the bunkhouse with the empty coffee tray, that she caught sight of a shape at the tree line beyond the north pasture still watching, gone the instant she turned her lantern toward it. She told Garrett at breakfast. He said nothing, but she saw the muscle jump in his jaw, and by that evening 2 more men had joined the night rotation, without a word of explanation offered to anyone. The delegation from town arrived 4 days after that, on a Sunday afternoon, 3 wagons and a handful of riders coming up the road in a loose, uneasy procession that had Silas calling for Garrett before they'd even reached the gate. Charlotte recognized the man leading them before he'd dismounted Reverend Hobbs' thin and stooped a man whose sermons had always leaned harder on judgment than mercy. And beside him, unmistakable in his fine dark coat, even from a distance, Ezra Sloan wearing an expression of practiced sorrowful concern that made Charlotte's stomach drop clean to her boots. "Mr. Coleman?" Reverend Hobbs did not dismount, addressing Garrett from the height of his wagon seat, like a man delivering a verdict he'd already decided. "We've come as concerned members of this community. Words reached town of the trouble you've brought down on yourself harboring a woman with an unsettled debt and an unclear character. We felt it our Christian duty to speak plain before matters go further. Her character's a good deal clearer than most who've come calling on my land lately." Garrett stood at the center of the yard, arms crossed, every hand on the ranch, drifting up quietly behind him, the way they'd done for Sloane alone in the yard days before. "Say what you came to say, Reverend, and then I'll thank you to be on your way. The town is prepared to overlook this lapse in judgment." Sloane cut in smoothly before the Reverend could answer. "If Mrs. Weaver returns to Larkspur Hollow to settle her affairs properly. Continued harboring only deepens the appearance of impropriety." "Mr. Coleman, folks are already talking. A respected rancher, an unmarried woman under his roof debts, unpaid. Surely you see how it looks." "I don't much care how it looks." Garrett's voice carried flat and cold across the yard, loud enough that every man and woman gathered there heard it plain. "I care how it is. And what it is a decent, hard-working widow who walked 11 miles rather than lie down and quit, and a banker who spent 2 weeks trying every crooked angle he can find to run her off my land because she's the one witness left who can call his forged paperwork exactly what it is." A murmur ran through the wagons. "That's a serious accusation, Coleman." Sloane said, his composure slipping the smallest fraction. "It's the truth, and you know it better than anyone standing in this yard." Garrett took a step forward, and Charlotte, watching from the porch, with her heart hammering, saw the whole delegation shift back half a pace without seeming to notice they'd done it. "You want to talk about appearances? Reverend, let's talk about a banker who rides out to a working ranch to threaten a widow, then rides back to town to gather a mob of good Christian folk to finish the job for him. That's the appearance I'd be concerned with were I in your boots." Nobody answered him. "Mrs. Weaver stays," Garrett said into the silence that followed. "She's under my protection. She's earning an honest wage, and any man who's got a legitimate legal claim against her is welcome to bring it before a judge with actual proof, instead of a wagon load of gossip. Until then, I'll thank every last one of you to get off my land." The delegation did not linger. Wagons turned one by one in a silence considerably more chastened than the confidence with which they'd arrived. Reverend Hobbs muttering something about prayer that nobody troubled themselves to answer. Sloane lingered longest, his eyes finding Charlotte where she stood on the porch, and the look he gave her before he turned his horse was not defeat. It was patience. The patience of a man who had simply decided to try a different road toward the same destination. "This isn't over," he said, quiet enough that only Charlotte closest to the porch rail caught the words clearly. "You'll see that soon enough, Mrs. Weaver." Then he was gone, riding out after the wagons, and the yard slowly loosened back into its ordinary rhythm, hands drifting back to chores, Mrs. Abernathy exhaling a breath she'd clearly been holding the whole confrontation through. "Well, I never—" Mrs. Abernathy said, pressing a hand flat to her chest as she climbed the porch steps. "Reverend Hobbs riding out here like the Lord himself sent him. I've half a mind to skip services this Sunday just to spite him." "You'll do no such thing, and you know it." Charlotte's voice came out unsteady, despite her best efforts, the fear only now catching up with her now that the danger had ridden off down the road. "Maybe not." Mrs. Abernathy patted her arm, brisk and warm. "But I'll enjoy thinking on it. That man's needed taking down a peg since before you were born, dear, and Mr. Coleman just did it plainer than any sermon I've sat through in 20 years. Silas ambled past with a low whistle of his own, tipping his hat toward Charlotte as he went. "Reckon the whole county'll hear how that went by Tuesday. Boss don't often raise his voice. When he does, folks tend to remember it." Garrett found Charlotte on the porch a few minutes later, the fight still simmering visible behind his eyes, even as his shoulders came down slow from where they'd been set hard through the whole exchange. "You didn't have to say all that," Charlotte said softly. "About the forged papers, in front of the whole town. Wasn't going to stand in my own yard and let a man like Sloane dress up a lie as Christian concern." He came to stand beside her at the rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even in the afternoon sun. "You've had enough folks decide who you are without asking Charlotte. I wasn't about to be one more." She did not trust her voice enough to answer that properly, so she simply reached for his hand again, and this time neither one of them pretended it meant anything less than it did. 3 quiet days passed, after that days almost peaceful enough that Charlotte let herself hope Sloane's patience had finally run its course. Garrett rode to the county courthouse himself on the second of those days, papers of his own tucked under his arm, and came back tight-lipped and unwilling to say more than that the fight was scheduled, and lawyers had been retained on both sides. Charlotte did not press him for details he wasn't ready to give. She had learned watching him that Garrett Coleman carried his worries the way he carried everything else, alone and quiet, until he'd worked out exactly what to do about them. It was well past midnight on the third night when Rufus began barking at the edge of the yard, low and steady and wrong in a way that had Charlotte sitting bolt upright in her narrow cabin bed before she'd even fully woken. She heard boots pounding across the porch. A raised voice. Silas's sharp with an urgency she had never once heard in it before, cutting through the dark. And beneath it, rising fast, unmistakable, even through the cabin walls, a sound that turned her blood to ice before her mind had fully caught up to naming it. The crackling hiss and roar of something catching fire, close and growing. Charlotte was out the cabin door before she'd found her second boot running barefoot across the yard toward a sky gone orange at the edges, the barn's east wall already swallowed in flame that climbed fast and hungry toward the hayloft. "Bucket line!" Silas was already shouting at hauling men out of the bunkhouse by the collar if they moved too slow. Well, to the trough to the barn move. Garrett came around the corner of the house at a dead-run shirt, still half-buttoned, and didn't so much as slow down at the barn doors before he vanished through them into the smoke. "Garrett!" Charlotte's voice tore out of her raw and helpless, and Dutch caught her arm before she could follow him in. "Horses, ma'am. He's after the horses. Man knows what he's doing." Dutch's grip was firm, not unkind, but it did not loosen. "You go in there hollerin' his name, you're just one more thing he's got to worry about pulling out." She hated that he was right. She hated it with her whole chest, standing useless at the edge of the bucket line while flame chewed through timber Garrett's father had likely raised with his own hands, while the screaming of frightened horses carried out into the night, loud enough to raise goose flesh on every arm in the yard. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at her elbow with a second bucket, thrusting it into her hands without ceremony. "Standing still won't save that barn, dear, and it won't save him either. Pass water. It's the one thing your hands can do right now that isn't waiting." Charlotte passed water. Her arms burned within minutes. Her shoulders screamed inside the first quarter hour, and still she passed bucket after bucket down the line, because Mrs. Abernathy was right, and because standing idle, while the man who'd taken her in fought a fire alone, was a kind of helplessness she refused to let herself sink into twice in one lifetime. Then the barn doors burst open and Garrett came stumbling out backward, hauling 2 horses by their halters, both of them wild-eyed and fighting him the whole way, and behind him Pete came out coughing black smoke with a 3rd horse in tow, and for one long terrible second Charlotte counted heads and came up 1 short. "Where's Willis?" "Went back for the milk cow," Pete rasped, doubled over. "Told him not to." Garrett was already moving again, one arm flung up over his face back into the smoke, before anyone could stop him this time, and Charlotte's heart climbed clean into her throat and stayed there through the longest 10 seconds of her life, until he came stumbling back out with Willis half carried under one arm, both of them coughing, both of them alive. The bucket line held the fire to the east wall and the loft above it. It took the better part of an hour, every hand on the ranch soaked through and blackened with soot, before the flames guttered down to smoking char, and Silas finally called the line off with a hoarse, exhausted shout. Charlotte reached Garrett before the smoke had even cleared from his lungs, both hands finding his face, his shoulders checking him over, with a franticness she made no attempt to hide. "I'm whole," he managed between coughs. "Horses are whole. Willis is whole. You went back in twice. Wasn't going to leave a man in there." He caught her hands where they'd found the front of his shirt, held them there against his chest a moment, both of them breathing hard in the firelight. "I'm all right, Charlotte. You are the single most stubborn man I have ever... Boss?" Silas's voice cut through grim, holding something up in the lantern light that stopped whatever Charlotte had been about to say, clean in her throat. A rag soaked black, the sharp reek of coal oil rising off it even from a distance. "Found this jammed under the east wall. And this." He held up a second item. A boot print pressed deep and clear into the soft mud by the horse trough, considerably finer heeled than any work boot on the Coleman spread. "Somebody set this deliberate," Silas said. "And they didn't come from around here." Garrett's jaw went hard as stone. "Fan out," he said. "Whoever did this didn't have time to get far, not with the whole yard lit up like daylight for the last hour." They found him 20 minutes later, crouched low in the brush along the fence line, not 400 yards out. A lean, unshaven man in a coat too fine for a drifter caught fast between two of Garrett's hands before he'd gotten more than a few running strides. "Get off me!" the man snarled, twisting hard against Pete's grip. "I ain't done nothing." "Coal oil on your hands says otherwise," Silas said, hauling him upright by the collar and marching him into the lantern light of the yard, where the whole crew had gathered, now soot-streaked and grim-faced, forming a loose, silent ring around him. Garrett stepped forward, and something in the set of his shoulders made even Silas step back half a pace. "Name," Garrett said. Just the one word, flat and cold. "Cobb." The man's eyes darted, looking for an exit that wasn't there. "Jesse Cobb. I was just passing through, I swear it, I didn't set no fire." "You've got coal oil soaked clean through your right glove." "Mr. Cobb, and a rag that matches it not 30 feet from where my barn near burned to the ground." Garrett's voice had not risen, but there was something in it now that made the hair stand up on the back of Charlotte's neck. "I've got 8 witnesses, and a marshal's right ahead of me either way. Question is, whether you tell me who paid you before I go, or whether you tell the marshal after, and I promise you, Mr. Cobb, my mood's considerably better right now than his is like to be." Cobb's resolve, thin to begin with, broke clean in half. "Sloan." He said the word tumbling out fast, desperate to get it said before he lost his nerve entirely. "Ezra Sloan. Paid me $20 to burn the barn, said it needed to look like an accident, said—" He swallowed hard. "Said if the fire spread far enough, spooked the herd bad enough, you'd have no choice but to sell out cheap or lose it all anyhow." The yard had gone dead silent. "I ain't proud of it," Cobb added, his voice dropping, some last scrap of shame surfacing now that the worst of it was already said. "Man's got a way of making a thing sound reasonable when you're 2 months behind on rent, and he's the only one offering coin. Didn't think on the horses none, nor the boy who near got trapped in there. Just thought on the $20. Said there was more coming too." Cobb added quieter still, like the confession had opened something in him he couldn't close back up. "Said the widow's papers were just the start. Said he's been working this land for 20 years and wasn't about to let one rancher and his cook stand in the way of him finishing it." 20 years, Charlotte repeated slowly. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "What does that mean, 20 years? Cobb shook his head fast. "Don't know. Swear it. He don't explain himself to hired men, ma'am. Just pays and points." Garrett looked at Charlotte over the top of Cobb's head, and she saw the same thought land in him that had just landed in her, that the boundary irregularity Sloan had filed against the Coleman land, grant the deed transfer 20 years past, was no coincidence at all. It was the same hand, the same forger, working the same crooked game on a longer, older debt than anyone in that yard had yet understood. "Silas, tie him to the porch post and keep 2 men on him through the night," Garrett said. "Come morning, we're riding for the marshal in Cheyenne. County judge and sheriff both eat supper at Sloan's table twice a month, near as I've ever seen, and I won't hand a confession like this to a man who'll lose the paperwork inside a week." "That's near 40 miles, boss," Silas said. "Then we'd best leave early." Garrett's eyes found Charlotte's. "You're coming with me. You've got the one thing, Cobb, doesn't you know how that forged note reads line for line? Marshall's going to want that laid out clear." Charlotte nodded, though her hands had not stopped shaking, not from fear now, so much as something that felt dangerously close to hope. It was well past 2 in the morning. By the time the yard finally settled, Cobb bound and guarded the barn's smoking ruin, cooling under a sky gone thick with stars, and Charlotte found herself in the kitchen with a basin of water and a roll of clean linen waiting for Garrett to sit still long enough to let her look at the burn along his forearm he'd been ignoring since he walked out of the smoke. "It's nothing," he said for the 3rd time, and for the 3rd time she ignored him. It is considerably more than nothing, Garrett Coleman, and if you don't sit down and let me tend it, I will ask Dutch to hold you down while I do." That got a tired huff of laughter out of him, and he sat. She worked in silence a while, cleaning the burn with careful hands, aware every moment of how close they sat, how the lantern light caught the exhaustion carved deep into his face, and did nothing at all to make him less handsome for it. He watched her work without complaint, without flinching his eyes on her face, rather than his own arm. "You went in that barn twice," she said quietly, winding linen around the burn. "For horses, for Willis. You didn't think twice either time. Didn't have time to think twice." "That's not what I mean." She tied off the bandage, but didn't let go of his arm right away. "I mean, you're the kind of man who runs toward the fire instead of away from it. I've known that about you since the day you stood in your own yard and told a whole town off on my account. But watching you walk back into a burning building without a moment's hesitation, Charlotte." His free hand came up gentle, tilting her chin so she'd look at him instead of the bandage. "I wasn't running toward the fire tonight because I don't value my own life. I ran toward it because there were people in that barn who matter to me. You're one of them. Have been since before I'd rightly admit it to myself." She did not trust herself to answer in words. She answered instead by leaning into the hand still cupped along her jaw, and for one suspended moment, in a kitchen that smelled of smoke and coal oil and clean linen, neither one of them moved at all. Then Rufus barked once sharp at the porch, and the moment broke as gently as it had begun. Both of them pulling back, both of them a little breathless. "Get some sleep," Garrett said low. "We ride at first light." They rode out at dawn with Cobb bound and mounted between two of Garrett's hands, Charlotte beside Garrett at the front of the small procession, the forged mortgage note folded careful in her pocket alongside Abigail's letter. Both of them silent for the first several miles, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavy over the whole party. They stopped once near midday to water the horses at a shallow creek crossing, and Charlotte found herself standing beside Garrett at the bank, while the others rested a stone's throw off. Cobb slumped miserable in his saddle under Silas's watchful eye. "You're quiet," Garrett said. "I keep thinking on what Cobb said. 20 years. She watched the water run clear over the stones, her own reflection broken and reformed with every ripple. "I spent 2 weeks thinking I was the only one Sloan ever ruined. Now I find out he's been doing this since before I was old enough to understand what a mortgage even was. Doesn't make what happened to you and Thomas any less cruel. No, but it makes it bigger than me. Bigger than just wanting my house back." She looked over at him, the morning light catching the tired lines of his face, the burn still wrapped careful beneath his sleeve. "If the marshal takes this seriously, if he truly means to go after 20 years of it, that's not just my fight anymore. Or yours." "No," Garrett agreed quietly. "It's every family Sloan's ever robbed a signature from. Every rancher who sold out cheap because he made them believe they had no other choice." He reached over, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the hard set of his jaw. "You walked 11 miles to ask a stranger for work, Charlotte. Turns out you might end up being the reason half this territory finally gets its land back." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and let him take her hand instead as they mounted back up and rode on. They were perhaps 15 miles out, cutting through a stretch of low scrub, where the road narrowed between two ridgelines when Garrett's hand shot out suddenly and closed hard around Charlotte's reins, pulling her horse up short. "Riders," he said low. 3 of them, coming up fast from the east ridge. Silas was already reaching for his rifle. "Sloan's men." "Only one way to find out." The 3 riders broke from the tree line at a hard gallop, closing the distance fast, and Charlotte's stomach dropped clean through the saddle when she recognized the man in front. Not Sloan himself, too careful for that, but a broad-shouldered gun hand she'd seen once before lingering outside Sloan's bank in Larkspur Hollow with the particular idle menace of a man paid to be menacing. "That's far enough," the lead rider called, reining up 30 yards out, a rifle already resting easy across his saddle horn. Mr. Sloan sends his regards and a message. Hand over the prisoner, and nobody on this road needs to get hurt today. Cobb's under my custody riding to the marshal in Cheyenne." Garrett's voice carried flat and even across the distance, though Charlotte could feel even seated beside him, the coiled readiness running through him like a wire pulled tight. "You're welcome to ride to Cheyenne yourself and take it up with the law there." Mr. Sloan don't much care for that particular suggestion. The gun hand's rifle came up an inch casual deliberate. "Now I'd sooner not shoot a rancher and a lady off their horses in broad daylight on account of it makes an awful mess of a man's morning. But I will Coleman if you push me to it. Hand over Cobb." Charlotte felt the world narrow down to a single terrible point, her pulse hammering loud enough to drown out even the wind. Beside her, Garrett had gone utterly still, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she had not heard from him before, quiet level and absolutely without give. "You've got a rifle pointed at a woman who walked 11 miles on bleeding feet rather than let a man like Sloan break her," Garrett said. "And you're betting your life that I'll hand over the one piece of proof that puts him behind bars before I let something happen to her. I'd think hard on that bet if I were you, because I promise you, I've got considerably less to lose than you think, and considerably more reason to make sure you regret drawing that rifle." "Big talk for a man outnumbered 3-5, the gun hand said, though something in his voice had thinned. 5-5, you mean?" Silas's voice came from just behind, and Charlotte realized, glancing back, that every hand who'd ridden with them had spread out quiet across the road, rifles up, forming a loose, deadly line that had not been there a moment before. "Reckon you didn't count on all of us, mister." The standoff held for 3 of the longest seconds Charlotte had ever lived through, the gun hand's eyes flicking across the line of raised rifles, doing the same grim arithmetic every man in that road was doing. "You'd truly risk 5 men's lives over one hired drifter," the gun hand said, though his voice had thinned considerably from where it started. "I'd risk considerably more than that." Garrett's tone hadn't changed a single degree. "Cobb's not the one I'm protecting today, mister. He's just the reason the fight found us on this particular stretch of road. Now, you can ride back to Sloan and tell him his hired gun looked 5 rifles in the eye and decided living was worth more than his wages, or you can find out today exactly how much I meant what I said. Your choice. I'm not asking twice." Somewhere behind Charlotte, she heard the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. Unhurried, deliberate Dutch, she realized, missing 2 fingers, and still perfectly capable of making the point plain. Then, slow and furious, he lowered his rifle. "Sloan's not going to forget this," he said, backing his horse a step. "Good." Garrett didn't blink. "Tell him I said so myself." The 3 riders wheeled and rode back east the way they'd come, and the road stayed silent a long moment after, nobody quite willing to be the first to breathe easy. "You could have been killed," Charlotte said once she'd found her voice again, her hands still shaking hard around her reins. "Standing there talking to a man with a rifle pointed at me like you had all the time in the world. Wasn't about to let him see me rattled." Garrett reached over, steadying her hands with his own a moment. "Man like that first sign of fear, he takes it as permission. I needed him thinking the cost of pulling that trigger was higher than he wanted to pay. And if you'd been wrong, I wasn't." His jaw was tight, but his eyes, when they found hers, had gone soft in a way that undid her considerably more than the danger had. "I don't gamble on much, Charlotte, but I'd gamble everything I own before I'd let a man like that put a bullet anywhere near you." They reached Cheyenne well past dark, the whole party worn thin from the day's travel, and the fear that had chased them the last 15 miles of its storefronts along the main street already shuttered for the night, except for the lamplight burning steady in a small office marked United States Marshal. Charlotte's legs had gone stiff and trembling by the time she dismounted, and Garrett's hand found the small of her back, steadying before she'd even asked for it. "Almost done," he said quietly. "Just tell him what you told me. Plain and true. That's all it takes." She nodded, smoothed her travel-worn skirts as best she could, and walked through the marshal's door, with her chin held high, the way she had walked through Garrett's gate weeks before, tired, frightened, and entirely unwilling to let either show. They found the federal marshal, a weathered, unhurried man named Wyatt Doss, willing to hear the whole account out by lamplight in his office while Cobb sat bound and sullen in the cell behind him. Doss read the forged mortgage note. He read Abigail's letter. He listened to Cobb's confession repeated word for word, and when Charlotte laid out line by careful line exactly how the signature on her mortgage differed from her late husband's true hand, the marshal's expression went from polite interest to something considerably more focused. "This isn't the first complaint I've had crossing my desk about Ezra Sloan," Doss said, finally setting the papers down. "Had 2 ranchers from up near the Sweetwater file similar grievances this past year. Forged notes, disputed deeds. Nothing I could act on without proof solid enough to survive a courtroom." He looked up at Charlotte, then at Garrett, then at Cobb's miserable hunched shape in the cell beyond. "Reckon between the 2 of you and Mr. Cobb here, I've finally got it." "You'll arrest him," Garrett said. "I'll ride out with a deputy and a warrant inside the week." Doss's eyes had gone hard, the look of a lawman who'd been waiting a long while for exactly this kind of evidence to land on his desk. "Man's been robbing this territory blind for the better part of 20 years, near as I can tell, hiding behind a banker's coat in a town too scared or too indebted to say otherwise. That ends now, Mrs. Weaver. You've got my word on it." Charlotte sat very still, the weight of 2 years of Thomas's death and the mortgage, and the long, hungry road that had led her to Garrett's gate, finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest for the first time since November. 20 years. She said softly, echoing Cobb's words from the night before. "How many others do you suppose? More than either of us wants to count, I expect." Garrett's hand found hers on the desk between them, steady and sure. "But we're done letting him take one more thing from anybody starting tonight." Marshal Doss cleared his throat, not unkindly, and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Then let's get it all down proper from the beginning," he said. "Every last detail. I want a case so tight Ezra Sloan doesn't so much as find a crack to crawl through." Charlotte looked at Garrett, once drew a steadying breath, and began to talk. They were near 2 hours into it, the marshal's pen scratching steady across page after page, when a deputy burst through the office door without knocking, breathless hat still in hand. "Marshal, telegraph just came through from Larkspur Hollow." He held the paper out, and Doss read it fast, his expression sharpening by the second. "Sloan's cleared out his account at the bank. Bought a ticket on tomorrow morning's stage east. Word's already spreading through town about the arson and the widow's forged note. Man knows the noose is tightening, and he's aiming to be long gone before anybody can tighten it." The room went cold and quiet. "Tomorrow morning?" Garrett repeated. "That's not a week, Doss. That's hours." Marshal Doss was already on his feet, reaching for his coat. His earlier unhurried calm burned clean away. "Then we don't wait for a warrant to catch up to us proper. We ride tonight and we ride hard, and God help Ezra Sloan if he's already boarded that stage by the time we reach Larkspur Hollow." Charlotte's heart slammed hard against her ribs. "I'm coming," she said. "Charlotte, I have spent 2 years being told to wait quietly while other people decided my fate for me. Garrett Coleman and I am done with it." She met his eyes steady, despite the tremors still running through her hands. "I want to look that man in the eye when they put the irons on him. I have earned that much." Garrett studied her a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face settled the matter faster than any argument could have. "Saddle up," he said, already moving for the door. "All of us. We ride within the hour." Marshal Doss was already shouting for a second deputy, for fresh horses, for every man who could hold a badge or a rifle to be roused from whatever bed he'd found in town that night, and within the hour the whole company was mounted and moving hard through the dark toward Larkspur Hollow, toward a morning stage that would either carry Ezra Sloan away clean or carry him nowhere at all. Charlotte rode at Garrett's side through the cold, star-thick night, exhaustion burned clean out of her by something fiercer and steadier that had taken its place and found somewhere in the pounding rhythm of the horse's hooves that she was no longer afraid of what the morning might bring. She was ready for it. They rode into Larkspur Hollow just as the sky began to lighten gray along the eastern ridge. the stage station already stirring a driver checking harness on a coach parked outside the depot while a handful of early risers loitered on the boardwalk with their morning coffee. There. Garrett's voice was low urgent, his eyes fixed on a figure emerging from the bank across the street, a leather traveling case in one hand and a hat pulled low against the coming daylight. Ezra Sloan. He was moving fast for a man trying not to look like he was hurrying, cutting across the street toward the waiting coach, and Charlotte's heart slammed hard against her ribs as Marshal Doss put his horse into a canter and closed the distance before Sloan had gone another 10 steps. Ezra Sloan. Doss's voice cracked across the quiet street like a rifle shot, and every head on the boardwalk turned at once. United States Marshal, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit arson. Stand where you are. Sloan froze. For one long moment, Charlotte thought he might run anyway, and she saw his eyes flick toward the coach, toward the driver, already climbing up into his seat, doing the same desperate arithmetic Cobb's gun hand had done on the road the day before. Then his shoulders sagged just slightly, the traveling case slipping from his fingers to land with a soft, defeated thud in the dust. This is absurd. His voice found its old smoothness, even now pitched to carry to the gathering crowd rather than to the marshal in front of him. I'm a respected member of this community. Whatever wild accusations you've been fed by a bitter widow and a rancher with a grudge, save it for the judge. Doss swung down, closing the distance on foot, a pair of iron cuffs already in hand. I've got a signed confession from your hired man on the barn fire at the Coleman Ranch. I've got a forged mortgage note with a widow's dead husband's name on it that doesn't match a single letter of his true signature. And I've got 2 more ranching families up near the Sweetwater who are going to want a word with you once this gets out. The color drained clean out of Sloan's face. You can't prove any of that holds together, he said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice, replaced by something considerably more brittle. Reckon a jury's going to decide that, not you. Doss closed the cuffs around his wrists with a hard final click that seemed to echo the whole length of the street. Ezra Sloan, you're going to spend a good long while explaining 20 years of other people's ruined lives to a federal court starting today. The crowd on the boardwalk had grown considerably in the last few minutes, drawn by the marshal's raised voice and the sight of the town's most powerful man standing cuffed in the street at dawn, and Charlotte felt every eye in Larkspur Hollow shift slow and disbelieving from Sloan's stricken face to her own. She did not look away from any of them. Charlotte Weaver. An older man pushed forward through the gathering crowd, hat clutched in both hands, his face weathered and lined in a way that spoke of decades under a hard sun. Charlotte recognized him after a moment, Amos Miller, whose land bordered the Coleman Ranch to the north, whose sons she had heard mentioned more than once by Silas over the weeks. Is it true, what the marshal's saying about the forged papers? It's true, Mr. Miller. Charlotte's voice came out steadier than she felt. He forged my husband's signature on a mortgage note that never existed until after Thomas died. Amos Miller's jaw worked a long moment, some old grief surfacing behind his eyes. My brother sold his spread to Sloan 12 years back. He said, finally quiet enough that only those nearest caught it. Man swore up and down there was a lien against the property my brother never knew he'd signed. Sold for 1/3 what the land was worth, just to clear himself of a debt he always claimed wasn't his to begin with. He looked at Sloan, cuffed and silent now in the marshal's grip, and something hardened in the old rancher's face. Died 2 years later, broke and ashamed. Always did wonder if that signature was truly his. It very likely wasn't, Garrett said quietly, coming to stand beside Charlotte. Marshal. Amos Miller's voice carried, now pitched for the whole gathered crowd. You'll want my testimony too, I reckon, once this goes to court. And I'd wager I'm not the only one standing on this street with a story just like mine. A murmur ran through the crowd, uneasy shifting, and Charlotte watched as one face after another turned inward, remembering, recalculating years of quiet loss. They had perhaps never let themselves examine too closely until this exact moment. Reverend Hobbs stood near the back of the gathering, his face gone pale and stricken, and when his eyes met Charlotte's across the crowded street, he did not hold her gaze long. Mrs. Weaver. He came forward at last, hat in hand, considerably less certain than the man who'd ridden onto Garrett's land a week before to lecture her on Christian propriety. "I owe you an apology, a considerable one. I let a man's reputation and his standing in this town speak louder than plain decency, and I am ashamed of it." Charlotte looked at him a long moment. She thought of 2 weeks spent walking of doors, closed in her face, of a town that had decided her worth before she'd said a single word in her own defense. "I accept your apology, Reverend," she said finally. "But it's not me you owe the larger debt to. It's every family standing on this street who trusted a banker's word over their own eyes because a man of your position told them it was the Christian thing to do." The Reverend had no answer for that, and Charlotte did not wait for one. The banker's clerk, a thin, nervous young man named Whitmore, who had worked under Sloane for 3 years, approached next, hesitant, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Weaver." He glanced back toward the bank, then to her like a man deciding something difficult. "There's ledgers in that office. Old ones going back further than my time there. I always thought some of the entries looked strange, dates that didn't line up, signatures that seemed copied over rather than signed fresh. I never said anything. Didn't seem my place, and I needed the wages." His voice dropped, ashamed. "I'll testify to what I've seen if the marshal wants it. Seems the least I owe you and everyone else he wronged." "The marshal will want it very much, Mr. Whitmore." Charlotte kept her voice gentle, though the reminder of how many quiet complicities had let Sloane operate so long sat heavy in her chest. "Thank you for saying so." A stout woman in a faded blue dress pushed forward. Next one Charlotte did not recognize, gray-haired and weathered, her eyes bright with something between grief and vindication. "My husband and I lost our dairy farm to that man 8 years back," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Told us the note was overdue when we'd paid every installment on time, showed us paper we'd never signed. We had no proof to say otherwise, so we packed up and left with nothing but a wagon and our pride." She looked to Sloane's wagon, then back to Charlotte. "Wanted you to know you're not the first he's tried to break, Mrs. Weaver. Just the first with the strength to stand and fight back where the rest of us couldn't." Charlotte reached out and took the woman's hand, unable to find words equal to what had just been offered her. "Then let's make certain you're not the last one heard," she said finally. "Marshal Doss is taking every account, yours included." By the time the wagon carrying Sloane rolled out toward Cheyenne under armed guard, bound for the territorial jail to await trial, no fewer than 6 townsfolk had come forward with stories of their own. Each one a small aching echo of Charlotte's. Each one a thread in a pattern that had taken 20 years, and one stubborn widow's 11-mile walk to finally pull loose. The crowd slowly began to disperse in small murmuring clusters, the whole of Larkspur Hollow reordering itself around a truth it had spent 20 years too comfortable to examine. Charlotte stood in the middle of the quieting street and found to her own surprise that the satisfaction she'd expected to feel had arrived, tangled up with something else entirely. Grief, sharp and sudden for Thomas, who had not lived to see this morning. For every year he'd spent believing right up until the fever took him that hard work and honest dealing were enough to keep a person safe in this world. "You did that," Garrett said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Every bit of it. Cobb's confession only mattered because you had the courage to walk 11 miles instead of lying down where Sloane left you. I didn't do it alone." "No," he agreed. "But you're the reason it happened at all." Charlotte asked before they rode home if they might stop at the small cemetery on the edge of town, and Garrett did not question it, only turned his horse toward the low iron fence without a word. But first they passed the mercantile, its owner a narrow woman named Mrs. Preston, who had once refused Charlotte credit for a spool of thread on account of her being, in the woman's own words that long ago afternoon, clearly a poor risk for anything requiring restraint. Standing now in her doorway, with her hands twisted anxious in her apron, "Mrs. Weaver." She stepped forward, uncertain, glancing at the dispersing crowd like she expected to be turned away. "I heard what happened, what Sloane did to you and to the others." She swallowed hard. I was unkind to you that day you came in asking after credit. I judged you before I knew a single true thing about your circumstances. And I've thought on it more than once, since wondering what became of you." Charlotte considered her a long moment. It would have been easy, and not entirely undeserved, to let the woman sit with her shame a while longer. "We all judge too quick sometimes, Mrs. Preston," she said instead. "I've found it costs a great deal more to hold on to the grudge than to simply do better going forward. I'd rather you remembered this morning than that afternoon, if it's all the same to you." Mrs. Preston's eyes went bright and wet, and she nodded quick and grateful, and Charlotte walked on toward the cemetery, with a lightness in her chest that surprised her, not triumph exactly, but something closer to peace, the particular ease of a woman who had finally stopped needing a town's good opinion to know her own worth. Thomas's grave sat plain and modest beneath a young cottonwood, the marker simple, the ground still settling after 8 months. Charlotte knelt beside it a long while, Garrett standing a respectful distance off, his hat in his hands. "I kept my promise," she said quietly to the stone, to the man who could not hear her, and to some quieter part of herself that needed to say it aloud regardless. "You always said I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. Took me walking 11 miles and near losing everything to finally believe you." She pressed her palm flat against the cool earth a moment. "I'm not sorry for what comes next, Thomas. I think you'd understand that better than anyone." She stayed a moment longer, remembering him not as the fever had left him gaunt and gray in that last terrible week, but as he'd been the whole of their 4 years together, whistling over the wash basin of a morning patient with her, when the garden failed 2 summers running, never once, not in word or in look, making her feel her size was anything but exactly as it should be. He had loved her plainly and without condition, and she understood now, kneeling in the grass above him, that his love had been the first proof she'd ever had that such a thing was possible. Garrett's had simply been the second. "Thank you," she whispered, so quiet even she barely caught the words, "for teaching me how to recognize it when it came around again." When she rose, Garrett was there, steady, offering his arm without a word, and she took it, and together they walked back to the horses in a silence that held no more grief in it than gratitude. They reached the ranch well past noon, and word of Sloane's arrest had somehow already outrun them, because the whole crew was gathered in the yard waiting, Mrs. Abernathy at the front of them wringing her apron, Dutch grinning wide enough to show the gap in his back teeth. "Well," Silas called out before either of them had fully dismounted. "Don't leave a man in suspense, boss. He's in irons riding for the territorial jail as we speak." Garrett swung down and the yard erupted. Dutch let out a whoop that startled every bird off the barn's remaining roofline. Pete pumped both fists in the air like he'd won a foot race, and Willis, still favoring his bad shoulder, managed a one-armed embrace of anyone standing close enough to catch. "Lord have mercy." Mrs. Abernathy pressed both hands to her face, laughing in near tears all at once. "I never did think I'd live to see that man answer for a single thing he's done in this county." "Wasn't just us that brought him down," Charlotte said, raising her voice over the celebration. 6 other families stepped forward before we'd even left town. Folks Sloane ruined years before he ever met me. Then here's to every last one of 'em." Dutch produced from somewhere inside his coat a bottle of something amber that Mrs. Abernathy eyed with deep suspicion, and poured a small measure into a row of tin cups, passed hand to hand around the yard. "To Mrs. Weaver, who walked 11 miles on nothing but grit, and came out the other side with the whole county owing her a debt it can't never rightly repay. To Mrs. Weaver." The yard echoed rough and warm, and Charlotte stood in the middle of it with her throat gone tight, thinking that she had arrived at this ranch a month ago with nothing but a torn shawl and a letter, and now stood surrounded by more genuine warmth than Larkspur Hollow had offered her in the whole of her married life. The celebration wound down slow into evening chores, still needing doing, regardless of the day's victories, and it was full dark by the time the yard finally quieted, and Charlotte found herself alone in the kitchen with Garrett, the two of them worn through in the particular satisfied way of people who had earned their rest honestly. The days that followed moved differently than any Charlotte had known since Thomas's death. Full purposeful, the particular busy relief of a life reassembling itself after a long fall. A county clerk rode out from Cheyenne within the week, carrying a formal order voiding the fraudulent mortgage note in full, and restoring clear title to what remained of Charlotte's homestead, though she had already decided quietly that she had no desire to return to a house that had only ever held grief for her. A second order filed the same visit cleared the irregularity on the Coleman land grant once and for all. The original forged transfer struck from county record, and Garrett's father's honest claim reaffirmed in full. 20 years he held that over your family? Charlotte said, reading over the cleared documents at the kitchen table while Garrett looked on. And you never even knew it. Didn't need to know it to feel it. Garrett's jaw tightened, remembering. My father used to say Sloan circled this ranch like a buzzard, waiting on something to die. Never understood why, until now. What will you do now that it's settled? Keep ranching. He said it simple, like there had never been any other answer worth considering. Same as I've always done, only now I don't spend every season wondering when the other boot's going to drop. He looked at her, something careful and searching in his expression. What about you, Charlotte? Debt's cleared. Land's yours again if you want it. Nothing tying you to this ranch anymore, not the way there was a month back. The question landed harder than she expected, and she understood watching his face that he had been turning it over some while before he finally asked it plain. Do you want me gone? Garrett Coleman? God, no. The words came out fast, rougher than his usual careful control, and he seemed almost startled by his own vehemence. That is the last thing on this earth I want, and I think you know it. Then why ask? Because I don't want you staying out of obligation, or fear of starting over somewhere new. He set the papers aside, turning fully to face her, and Charlotte felt the whole kitchen go still and small around the two of them. I want you staying, because it's what you want. Not because Sloan took your other choices away, and this was the only door left standing. And if I said I wanted my own place, started fresh somewhere new, proved to myself I could stand entirely on my own 2 feet without leaning on anybody's kindness. Something flickered across Garrett's face, quick and carefully controlled, but not quick enough that Charlotte missed it. Then I'd help you pack the wagon myself, and I'd mean it, he said, and she believed him, which somehow made the offer land even harder in her chest. I told you once I judge a person by their work and their word, not by what they owe me for kindness already given. That's still true whatever you decide. You'd let me go, just like that. I didn't say it wouldn't near kill me. His voice roughened, the careful composure cracking at last. I've spent 10 years telling myself I didn't need anybody standing beside me. Then you walked through my gate and proved me a liar inside a month. If you tell me tomorrow you're riding out to build something of your own, I'll saddle your horse, and I'll watch you go, because that's what loving somebody plain and honest looks like. But I'd be lying if I told you it wouldn't leave this ranch a good deal emptier than it was before you came. Charlotte considered that a long moment, weighing the truth of it with the same careful honesty she'd have wanted from him. I walked through your gate because I had nowhere else to go, she admitted. That much is true. But I've stayed near a month since Garrett, and every reason I had left weeks ago. I stayed because Dutch makes me laugh over breakfast. Because Willis asks after my opinion, like it matters to him. Because Mrs. Abernathy's become the closest thing to family I've had since Thomas passed. She paused, her voice dropping quieter, more exposed than she'd meant to let it get. And because somewhere in the middle of all that, I stopped being able to imagine a morning that didn't start with seeing your face across this kitchen. Garrett was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him, even in the worst of the danger they'd faced together. I built walls around myself for 10 years, Charlotte. Told myself it was safer that way. Told myself the ranch was enough, the work was enough that a man could live a full life on cattle and duty alone. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in both of his, careful, deliberate, the way a man handles something he does not intend to ever let go of again. Then a woman walked 11 miles on bleeding feet and collapsed at my gate, and every wall I'd spent 10 years building came down inside a month, and I didn't even see it happening until it was already done. Garrett. Let me finish, please. His thumb traced slow, absent circles over her knuckles, and his eyes, when they met hers, held nothing guarded in them at all. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. Never have been. So when I tell you I love you, Charlotte Weaver, I need you to understand that isn't gratitude talking or loneliness or the excitement of a hard fight finally won. It's plain, simple truth, and it's been true for longer than I let myself admit. Charlotte's breath caught somewhere deep in her chest, tears rising sudden and unbidden, and she found she could not have spoken even if she'd wanted to. I love you, Garrett said again, steadier now, like a man laying the final board of something he intended to stand on for the rest of his life. Your strength, your stubbornness, the way you looked Sloane dead in the eye and never once let him decide who you were. I love you exactly as you are, Charlotte, every part of you, and I am not interested in a single version of you that isn't the one sitting across this table right now. I love you too. She managed finally, the words coming out thick and unsteady, and entirely true. I have for weeks. I was only too frightened to say it after Thomas, after everything. You don't have to be frightened of this. He lifted her hand, pressed his lips careful and warm against her knuckles, and Charlotte felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since November finally fully let go. Not with me, not ever. They sat like that a long while, hands joined across the table, the cleared land papers forgotten between them, the whole ranch settling into its evening rhythm outside the kitchen window. Dutch's low laugh carrying from the bunkhouse. Rufus barking once, at nothing in particular, the ordinary unremarkable sounds of a life Charlotte had never quite let herself hope for again. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Garrett said, finally. His voice gone quiet, almost hesitant, in a way entirely unlike him. Been carrying it around near a week now, waiting for the right moment. Kept telling myself it wasn't yet on account of everything else going on. But I don't much feel like waiting any longer, Charlotte, and I don't reckon there's ever going to be a moment that feels more right than this one does. Charlotte's heart climbed into her throat, her hand tightening around his without her quite meaning it to. Garrett? A sharp knock rattled the kitchen door before he could say another word, and both of them startled Garrett's hand dropping instinctively toward his hip before he caught himself. Boss? Willis's voice muffled, apologetic. Sorry to trouble you this late. Fence gates come loose on the south pasture, and Silas figured you'd want to know before the cattle wandered clean off in the night. Garrett closed his eyes a moment, drew a long breath, and Charlotte, despite the interruption, found herself fighting down a laugh at the sheer ordinary timing of it. Tell Silas I'll see to it first thing at sunup, Garrett called back, not moving an inch from his seat across from her. It'll hold till morning. Yes, sir. A pause, then more sheepish. Sorry again, boss. Willis's footsteps retreated across the porch, and Garrett turned back to Charlotte, a rueful, helpless sort of smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Where was I? You were about to lose your nerve by your own account. Charlotte's voice came out warmer than she intended, threaded through with the same nervous joy climbing through her own chest. Something about a week's worth of carrying a question around. Right. He shook his head once, like a man resetting himself, and reached for her hand again, steadier this time, more certain. Let me get it out plain before something else comes knocking. He drew a breath, steadying himself the way she'd seen him steady himself in front of Sloane, in front of the delegation, in front of a rifle pointed straight at her, the particular stillness of a man about to do something that mattered more than his own comfort. Charlotte Weaver, I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this. He reached into his coat pocket, and Charlotte's breath stopped entirely, waiting. What he drew from his coat pocket was not the velvet box Charlotte had half braced herself for, but a ring of plain gold, simple and unadorned, small enough that he had to hold it careful between two fingers. It was my mother's, Garrett said, his voice gone rough at the edges. Not Rachel's. I want that said plain so there's no ghost sitting at this table with us tonight. This ring belonged to a woman who taught my father the same thing I've learned watching you these past weeks, that a life built on honesty and hard work is worth considerably more than one built on appearances or ease. He turned it slow between his fingers, catching the lamplight. I've been carrying it around since the day we rode back from Cheyenne, waiting for the right moment, and I've come to understand there isn't ever going to be a moment that feels entirely safe to ask a question this big. so I'm asking anyway." He came around the table and knelt, and Charlotte's whole chest went tight and trembling at the sight of him there. This tall, steady, unshakable man, folded down in front of her, like the whole world had narrowed to the small space between them. "Charlotte Weaver," he said, "will you marry me?" She had imagined in the secret places, she rarely let herself wander what this moment might feel like if it ever came at all. She had not imagined it would feel quite like this. Not triumphant, not dizzy with disbelief, but simply quietly right, like a door closing gently on a room she no longer needed, and opening onto one she'd been walking toward her whole life without knowing it. "Yes," she said, and then, because once did not seem like enough to hold the whole of what she felt, yes, Garrett Coleman 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that were not for the first time since she'd known him entirely steady, and when he rose and drew her up into his arms, Charlotte felt herself lifted clean off her feet, laughing and crying. Both at once, the two of them turning slow circles in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and cleared land papers, and the particular warm certainty of a life finally truly beginning. Rufus barked once at the commotion, and neither of them cared in the slightest. Word traveled through the ranch faster than any fire had, and within the hour, half the crew had found some excuse to wander past the kitchen window until Mrs. Abernathy finally threw open the door. Herself took one look at the ring on Charlotte's hand, and the color still high in both their faces, and let out a whoop that would have done Dutch proud. "Well, it's about time," she declared, sweeping Charlotte into an embrace that smelled of flower and lavender water. "I've been watching the two of you dance around it for a month like a pair of green colts. Lord, but I'm glad to see sense finally win out." "You knew?" Charlotte asked, laughing. "Dear, the whole county knew. Even Reverend Hobbs likely suspected, and that man wouldn't notice a stampede coming through his own front parlor." Mrs. Abernathy held Charlotte back at arm's length, studying her with eyes gone suddenly bright and wet. "Your Thomas would be glad of this. I never knew him, but I know grief when I see it walk through a gate, and I know what it looks like when it finally starts to heal. This is that, dear. This is exactly that." Dutch proposed a second toast before the night was through, considerably more elaborate than the first, involving what he swore was his grandmother's recipe for spiced cider. Though nobody quite believed the spices in question were legal in every territory. And Silas shook Garrett's hand with the particular gruff warmth of a man who had watched his boss carry 10 years of loneliness and was glad at long last to see it set down. "Never thought I'd see the day," Silas said. "Boss going soft over a cook." "Watch your mouth, Judd," Garrett said, though there was no heat in it at all, only a wide, unguarded happiness that sat strange and wonderful on a face Charlotte had first known only for its careful, watchful stillness. News of the engagement reached Larkspur Hollow within days, carried Charlotte suspected by Willis, who had taken to riding into town on the flimsiest of errands ever since the arrest, always returning with fresh gossip, and a grin he couldn't quite suppress. The reception it received in town stood in such stark contrast to the reception Charlotte herself had once received, that she found it almost dizzying to hold both memories at once. The woman who'd walked 11 miles and been whispered about at every turn, and the woman now stopped on the boardwalk by well-wishers, offering congratulations with genuine warmth in their eyes. "Funny thing, forgiveness," she said to Garrett one evening, turning the gold ring absently on her finger. "A month ago, half that town wouldn't meet my eye. Now they can't stop smiling at me." "Some of that's Sloane's arrest," Garrett admitted. "Folks feel considerably more generous once they realize how badly they misjudged a situation. But I'd wager some of it's simply you, Charlotte. You never once let their opinion decide who you were, even when it would have been easier to. People notice that eventually, even if it takes them longer than it ought to." Mrs. Preston of all people sent over a length of fine blue cloth within the week unasked, with a note that read simply, "For the wedding dress. Mrs. Weaver, and my sincerest apologies, again for the thread." Charlotte sat with that note in her hands a long while before she let herself cry over it. Not from hurt this time, but from the strange, humbling relief of watching old wounds close over. Mrs. Abernathy took over the dress herself, refusing outright to let Charlotte hire it done in town. "I sewed for 30 years before I ever set foot on this ranch." she said, pins clenched between her teeth as she worked Charlotte standing patient, atop an overturned crate in the parlor, while the housekeeper measured and pinned and muttered to herself. I'll not have some Cheyenne seamstress who's never met you take a tape to your figure and start suggesting you ought to be cinched into something that pinches. You'll wear a dress that fits the woman you are, dear, not some notion of a woman you're meant to shrink yourself into. You needn't go to such trouble. Hush. Mrs. Abernathy did not so much as look up from her pinning. I buried my own husband 20 years back, and I never thought I'd see anybody make Garrett Coleman smile the way you do, not in all the years I've kept his house. This is no trouble at all. This is the finest work I've done in a decade, and I intend to enjoy every stitch of it. Charlotte caught her own reflection in the parlor's small spotted mirror as Mrs. Abernathy worked and found herself studying it a long moment. The soft width of her shoulders, the fullness. Larkspur Hollow had once measured her worth by and found wanting. All of it gathered now beneath fabric. Cut generous and fine, meant to fit the body she actually had, rather than one she'd spent years being told she should apologize for. She did not look away from the mirror the way she once might have. She looked instead like a woman finally allowed to take up exactly the space she'd always deserved. There was one evening close on the wedding when the old doubt crept back, regardless, quiet and uninvited, the way old grief sometimes does, even after the wound's mostly closed. What if I'm not what a woman like Rachel was? Charlotte said low, unable to fully look at Garrett as she said it, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. What if the town starts whispering again once the excitement of Sloane's arrest fades? What if you wake up one morning and see only what they always saw? Garrett set down what he was doing and came to sit beside her, taking both her hands in his without hesitation. I've buried one love already. Charlotte and I spent 10 years afterward believing I'd used up whatever capacity I had for it, he said, quiet and steady. Then you walked through my gate, and it turned out I hadn't used up anything at all. What I feel for you isn't some pale echo of what I felt for Rachel. It's its own thing, entirely built on watching you feed 40 hungry men without complaint, stand up to a banker twice your size in influence, and walk back into your own grief with your chin held high enough to shame half this county. That's not a woman I'll ever wake up seeing any smaller than she is. That's not possible, not for me. You're certain. I have never in my life been more certain of a single thing. He lifted her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles, steady and warm. Whatever this county whispers, Charlotte, they'll be whispering about a woman I chose with my whole clear mind, not one I settled for. There's a considerable difference, and I intend to remind you of it every day for the rest of our lives, if that's what it takes. The doubt did not vanish entirely. Old wounds rarely close all at once, but it loosened its grip enough that Charlotte found she could breathe past it, and that she was learning was very often the most any healing offered at first. Word arrived from Marshal Doss 10 days before the wedding, carried by a rider who'd come the long way from Cheyenne, specifically to deliver it himself. And Garrett read the letter twice through before he finally set it down, and looked at Charlotte with something like fierce, quiet satisfaction. Sloane's been formally charged on 11 counts, he said. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit arson and obstruction, with testimony pending from 9 separate families across 3 counties. Doss says the federal prosecutor expects a conviction inside the month, and a sentence that'll keep the man behind bars considerably longer than either of us will likely live to see him free again. Charlotte sat with that a long moment, feeling something in her chest finally fully unclench. 11 counts, she repeated softly. 9 families. Including 2 Doss rights, who've already had their land titles restored on the strength of what came out of your testimony alone. Garrett folded the letter, careful, set it aside. You did that, Charlotte. Whatever else this past month has cost either of us, that's worth remembering plain. A woman who was told she had no standing in this territory just handed 9 families their homes back. I only wanted my own house back, she said quietly. Never imagined it would come to all this. Most of the best things a person does don't start out looking like much, Garrett said. They start out looking like a woman too stubborn to lie down and quit. The wedding took place on a clear morning 3 weeks later, Beneath the same old cottonwood that shaded the eastern edge of the yard, its branches hung with wildflowers. Willis and Pete had ridden out at dawn to gather the whole crew scrubbed and pressed into their best clothes for the occasion. Mrs. Abernathy fussing over every last detail with the fierce, tender authority of a woman who had waited a long while to see this particular day arrive. Amos Miller came and brought half a dozen neighboring families with him, ranchers whose own stories had been swept up in Sloane's downfall, come now to celebrate, rather than mourn, what one honest testimony had set right. Even Reverend Hobbs stood among the gathered guests, considerably humbled from the man who'd once ridden onto Garrett's land to lecture on propriety, and when he offered to perform the ceremony himself, his voice carried none of its old judgment, only a quiet, genuine gladness. Abigail Purnell arrived early before most of the other guests, finding Charlotte in the small side room of the ranch house where Mrs. Abernathy had laid out the finished dress. "I very nearly didn't believe it when Willis rode into town with the news," Abigail said, taking both of Charlotte's hands in hers, her eyes already bright with tears. "The last I saw of you, you were walking off toward the horizon with nothing but a torn shawl and my letter. And I confess, I spent that whole first week wondering if I'd sent you to your death instead of to safety. You sent me exactly where I needed to go," Charlotte said, squeezing her hands. "I would never have made it through that gate without your kindness, Abigail. I mean that plainly. You were the only person in this whole town who looked at me and saw something worth helping back, when everyone else had already decided otherwise." "I only wrote down an address I'd heard mentioned in passing." Abigail waved a hand, embarrassed by the praise. "You're the one who walked 11 miles on it." "Then let's agree it took both of us," Charlotte said, and pulled her into an embrace that held a full year of gratitude in it, "and that I'll be forever glad you were the kind of woman who didn't look away." Charlotte stood at the edge of the yard in Mrs. Abernathy's careful handiwork, blue fabric catching the morning light, and found she did not feel for the first time in longer than she could remember even the smallest flicker of the old shame that had once followed her into every room she entered. She felt instead exactly like herself. Exactly enough. Garrett waited for her beneath the cottonwood, tall and steady, in a coat she'd never seen him wear, his eyes finding hers the moment she stepped into the yard and holding there the whole slow walk across it, as though there were nothing else in the whole wide territory worth looking at. "You're staring," she murmured once she'd reached him. "I intend to keep doing it a good long while yet," he said low enough that only she could hear it, and the corner of his mouth curved up in that same faint, unguarded smile she'd come to love more than she had words to explain. Reverend Hobbs cleared his throat, and the yard settled into a hush. "We are gathered," he began, "to witness the joining of two people who have each in their own way walked through fire to arrive at this exact morning." Charlotte felt Garrett's hand tighten around hers, warm and certain. "Garrett Coleman," the Reverend continued, "do you take this woman in all her strength and all her tenderness to stand beside you through whatever this territory sees fit to send your way?" "I do." Garrett's voice did not waver, not once. "I've spent 10 years learning how to stand alone. I'd a good deal rather spend the rest of my years learning how to stand beside her instead." Charlotte Weaver. The Reverend turned to her, and Charlotte felt the whole gathered yard, every face she'd come to know and trust these past weeks, leaning in close around her like a wall built entirely of goodwill. "Do you take this man steady and true to be your husband in this life and whatever comes after?" "I do," Charlotte said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out clear and unshaking, carrying the particular certainty of a woman who had walked 11 miles on bleeding feet and found at the end of that road exactly the life she deserved all along. "I walked a long way to find him. I don't intend to walk away from him now." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the crowd, and Reverend Hobbs, smiling now in a way Charlotte had not once seen from him before, that morning pronounced them husband and wife before the whole assembled ranch, the whole reordered town, the whole wide Wyoming sky stretched clear and blue and endless above them. Garrett kissed her beneath the cottonwood's shifting shade, gentle and sure, and the yard erupted into cheering, loud enough to send every bird on the property scattering skyward. Dutch whooping loudest of all, Willis and Pete tossing their hats, Mrs. Abernathy weeping openly and without a shred of embarrassment about it, The celebration ran long into the afternoon. Tables set up beneath the cottonwood, groaning under more food than even Charlotte had ever cooked in a single sitting. Fiddle music, drifting up from somewhere near the barn, half the county dancing in the dust of a yard that had one short month before held nothing but a stranger's collapsed body and a town's cold judgment. Garrett pulled her into the dancing well past what any dignified rancher ought to attempt by his own cheerful admission, spinning her clumsily but earnestly across the packed dirt, while Dutch called out encouragement from the sidelines, and Mrs. Abernathy pretended not to be crying into a handkerchief. "You're a terrible dancer, Garrett Coleman," Charlotte informed him, laughing breathless. "Never claimed otherwise." He drew her closer, regardless, entirely unbothered. "Reckon you'll just have to marry me anyway." "Bit late for reconsidering now." "Wouldn't reconsider if you paid me the whole of this ranch to do it." He pressed his forehead to hers, the fiddle music swelling warm around them, and for a moment the whole noisy, joyful yard seemed to fall away entirely, leaving just the two of them, turning slow circles in the golden afternoon light. Amos Miller found Charlotte during a quiet lull, his weathered face soft with something like gratitude too large for easy words. "You gave this whole county something back it didn't know it was missing," he said. "Not just land, though there's plenty of that too now. You gave folks back their nerve to speak up when something's wrong, instead of swallowing it quiet the way we all did for 20 years. I only ever wanted my own small piece of it back," Charlotte said. "The rest just seemed to follow. Best things usually do." Amos tipped his hat and returned to his family, and Charlotte stood a moment in the golden last light of her wedding day, watching a yard full of people who had once been strangers move easy and laughing among each other, and thought that perhaps this, more than any single piece of land or any cleared debt, was the truest thing Sloane's downfall had restored. 1 year later, the Coleman Ranch bore little resemblance to the quiet, careful place Charlotte had first collapsed in front of at the end of an 11-mile walk. The barn stood fully rebuilt, its east wall stronger than the original had ever been, Garrett having insisted on new lumber straight through rather than patching the old damage over. The kitchen had become, by unanimous and unspoken agreement of the whole crew, the true heart of the ranch. Its table extended twice over the past year to accommodate not just the hands, but the growing circle of neighbors and friends who found their way there most evenings. Charlotte still rose before the sun. She still had breakfast on the table by 5 sharp, though now Mrs. Abernathy shared the work rather than carrying it alone. And now, more mornings than not, she found Garrett already awake beside her, watching her with the same steady, unguarded warmth he'd shown her that first startled evening on the porch. Dutch had at long last stopped proposing marriage over breakfast on account of Charlotte's actual husband threatening with great good humor to start charging him rent on the joke. Willis's shoulder had healed clean, and Pete had grown a full 2 inches and considerably more manners over the course of the year, though he still blushed scarlet any time Charlotte teased him about that first cruel morning at the stove. Silas had taken to calling her the boss's better half, with a perfectly straight face whenever Garrett was within earshot. And Mrs. Abernathy, who had buried a husband of her own 2 decades past and never once spoken of finding another, had lately taken to sharing quiet, unhurried suppers with Amos Miller on the evenings he rode over to check on the new fence line, a development the whole ranch had noticed, and none of them, out of genuine affection for her, dared tease her about directly. Ezra Sloane sat in a territorial prison, convicted on all 11 counts, his once considerable fortune seized and distributed in no small part back to the very families he'd spent 20 years quietly ruining. 9 homesteads had been restored to their rightful owners by the time the last of the paperwork cleared, and Marshal Doss had written once more near the year's end to say the investigation had since uncovered evidence of still more victims. Further east, the whole rotten scheme, finally, fully unraveling in the light Charlotte's courage had first let in. Larkspur Hollow itself had changed too slower and quieter than the courtroom victories, but changed regardless. Charlotte was stopped on the boardwalk these days, not with whispers, but with genuine warmth. Mothers introducing their daughters to her as though she were something worth aspiring to, rather than something to be pitied. And she understood walking those streets, now that the town's true reckoning had never really been about Sloane at all. It had been about a whole community, finally admitting how easily kindness gets traded away for comfort, and how much courage it takes to demand it back. On a warm evening that spring, Charlotte stood on the porch beside Garrett, watching the sun go down gold and endless over land that belonged in every sense that mattered now to both of them equally. "Do you ever think on it?" she asked. "The day you found me at the gate." "Every day." Garrett's arm came around her shoulders, easy and familiar. "I think on how close I came to only seeing what the rest of the county saw. A big woman half-starved collapsed in my dirt. Took me exactly as long as it took you to open your eyes and tell me you'd come for honest work, not pity, before I understood how wrong that first glance would have been. And now I look at you, and I don't see anything the county ever taught me to look for." He pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried, certain. "I see the strongest, kindest, most stubborn woman I've ever had the good fortune to meet, and I thank God every single morning that you were tired enough and brave enough to keep walking those last few miles instead of turning back." Charlotte leaned into him, watching the light fade soft over the fields, thinking of the woman she'd been on that dusty road a year ago, starving. Rejected, certain. The whole world had already decided her worth and found it wanting. She thought of Thomas and the quiet, steady love he'd given her first, and of Garrett, who had built on that foundation something neither grief nor fraud nor a whole unkind town had managed to break. She thought of Abigail Purnell's letter, folded soft and worn now from a year of being carried in her memory rather than her pocket. She thought of Amos Miller's brother dead before he ever saw justice done, and of the dairy farmer's wife who'd stood on a dusty street and thanked a stranger for finding the courage the rest of them hadn't. She thought of 9 families sleeping tonight in homes that were once again rightfully their own. She thought most of all of every woman who might one day feel exactly as small and unwanted as she once had, standing at the edge of some road of her own, certain there was no gate ahead worth reaching. There is always a gate worth reaching, she thought, even when the whole world insists otherwise. A person's worth was never carried in the size of her or the shape of her or the sum of what a town decided to whisper behind her back. It was carried always in the plain, stubborn courage to keep walking anyway, and in the rare, steady kind of love that looked at a woman exhausted and starving and saw, instead of something broken, someone worth building an entire life around. Garrett's arm tightened around her shoulders, and somewhere behind them, in the golden hush of the ranch house kitchen, Charlotte could hear Mrs. Abernathy humming softly over the supper dishes, could hear Dutch's low laugh carrying from the bunkhouse, could hear the whole ordinary, extraordinary sound of a family that had been built piece by patient piece, not out of blood or obligation, but out of choice. Charlotte Weaver had walked 11